On our special 50th episode of the Pool Pro podcast, we learn from returning guest Terry Arco. What Terry has to say about Breakpoint chlorination may shock you. Listen as the podcast begins now. Welcome back to the Pool Pro podcast. This is Michelle Cavanaugh, my co-host.
Dave Rockwell here.
Hey, Dave. We are excited to have this guest back again. He's been on before. He's always a pleasure to have on. Very knowledgeable, someone we highly respect. Terry Arco from HASA. He is the product training content manager. Welcome, Terry.
Hey, thanks. Happy to be here, Michelle and Dave. Good morning.
Absolutely. So, and most people know you, or probably a lot of people know you, Terry, but can you just remind people really how you got into the industry and really what your passion is in this industry?
Yeah, well, I was getting married and I needed money. So somebody offered me a job as a pool cleaner. So actually got in cleaning swimming pools. Had no idea what I was doing, but realized that I needed to learn a lot very quickly. And basically, I went from there to, I partnered with somebody who had a business, pool and spa business. He did building and remodels and service, and we did hot tub sales, chemical sales, pretty much everything in Southern California. So did that for several years, almost 10 years, working at managing that business. And then went from there to manufacturing and went to work for a pretty well-known chemical and specialty chemical manufacturer in Southern California, basically helping to develop product, doing technical service and technical writing and so forth. And that's pretty much what I've done for the last probably 30 years of my life. Right. I worked with one particular specialty chemical line company. I don't know if I can drop their name, but it was C-Clear. That's who a lot of people know me as. They kind of knew me as Mr. C-Clear. I was with them for 24 years. Sure. As their technical, basically technical manager with that. So lots of experience, and I've talked to a lot of people throughout the years, pool pros in the field, and have had my own practical experience in the field. And I've done a lot of training and a lot of writing. I think I have about over 100 published articles, which sounds really weird to me, but
it is an accomplishment, though. Yeah.
And I am a CPO instructor.
Yeah.
And I do also serve on the Recreational Water Quality Committee of PHTA.
Nice.
So we write a lot of fact sheets and things like that. So.
And it seems like you have a passion for educating folks and really just, training and keeping people up to date on what's going on. It seems like that's something that you really enjoy. So that's why we love having you on, Terry. Thanks so much.
Yeah, it is definitely a passion of mine. Going back to my day, there was very little education, so you really had to look hard for it. So that's really what gave me my passion is I wanted to learn, and then I also wanted to teach.
Yes.
And then I just love today because there's so many platforms like this to get education out. So
yeah, absolutely.
So today it's almost the other side of the coin. There's so much of it out there, and some of it conflicts, and you so you have to kind of pick and choose and learn the basics and then decide where to go from there.
that is true. That is true.
Yes.
So that brings us really to our topic today. We wanted to talk a little bit about Breakpoint chlorination. It's part of the CPO training. They teach you how to do the math but really when I was going through the process of becoming a CPO instructor, I was asked to teach that chapter, and I started getting grilled by my instructor, and I'm like, you know what? There's gaps in my knowledge on this subject, and I think maybe there is on a lot of us. So I wanted to delve a little deeper into it, and really starting with the basics, the definition of the terms. Now, we hear the terms breakpoint chlorination, that's the CPO term. The IPSA manual also talks about shocking, superchlorination, So how about a little definition of terms? Are these terms interchangeable? Are there differences in between in the processes we're talking about here?
Yeah, good question. And speaking of articles, I actually just wrote an article on exactly what you're asking.
Wow.
It was published in Aqua magazine, and I think the title of it was something like, superchlorination, shock, hyperchlorination, breakpoint, and because yeah, I mean that's my experience, and obviously being involved for as long as I have been, and being on the Recreational Water Quality Committee, we discuss these things a lot. There's a lot of discussion about what things mean. And I guess I would say the pretty analogous type of terminology in the pool industry is the word shock. And boy, I found out that sure covers a lot of things. When I was doing residential pools, I'll be quite honest with you, I did residential pools for almost 10 years. And I don't think I ever heard the term breakpoint, or if somebody said it, I wouldn't have even known what it was they were talking about. And it wasn't until I kind of stepped into the commercial realm and then took a CPO class and then I learned about breakpoint and what breakpoint was. But I can remember and do recall that the term shock, the term superchlorinate, the term hyperchlorinate, breakpoint, I think I even heard breakpoint, even though I didn't know what it was, referred to as shocking when I was doing residential pools. And so there's a lot of confusion there. And just going back even to, I think, early 2000s or whatever, the EPA and the American Water Chemistry Council came to the EPA, and there was confusion there about even the term shock. Was that something that meant that it had to be an EPA FIFRA registered product if it was a shock? What is shock doing? Is it killing bacteria? So forth. So there was confusion there. And at that time, there were non-chlorine shock products that were on the market. And the EPA was actually, those non-chlorine shock products didn't make any kind of killing claims on the label. But the term shock was going to become actually something where something would be required to be EPA registered as a pesticide, because they believed that term encompassed, the killing of bacteria. And so there was a lot of discussion and so forth that went on at that time, obviously with the manufacturers of the non-chlorine shock. And then so the EPA decided that if you use the term oxidizer or oxidating, either in front of the word shock or behind the word shock, and you didn't make any bacterial or organic contaminant claims, you only made non-living contaminant claims on the product, then it would not need the EPA registration. And so there was a lot of confusion there just at the term shock at that level. But the article I wrote basically, and just real quickly to wrap this up, Dave, is yes, there is a difference in those terms depending on what it is you're trying to accomplish. And so real quick, and certainly anybody can look up the article in Aqua magazine under my name. But superchlorination is really, superchlorination is more something you do basically to boost up the free available chlorine. It's something you do when maybe the water's a little flat or hazy and has more of a chlorine need. Maybe you've got a bit of algae beginning to form. So these are cases where you'd superchlorinate, and superchlorination generally, the definition of that is you're going to kick that your chlorine level to about 10 to 20 parts per million. Now hyperchlorination, that's a whole different thing. Hyperchlorination is you're really going to wipe out anything in that pool, and that's typically about a 40 ppm introduction of chlorine, and the typical scenario where hyperchlorination would be used would be in the instance of somebody who had if there's a fecal release or a fecal accident, and particularly if you're trying to deal with crypto and make sure that you inactivate crypto. So, going to raise the chlorine level 20 ppm, hold it there for 13 hours. That would be considered like a hyperchlorination as well. And then when you get to breakpoint, again, there's confusion there. And I've talked to guys I got a breakpoint in my pool. What do you mean you got a breakpoint in your pool? Well, I'm going to shock it. And, I was like, well, okay, but what are you attempting to do for that breakpoint? And so breakpoint, the traditional thing about breakpoint is We all know that when chlorine is introduced to water with any kind of contaminants, and there's always contaminants in pool water, after the chlorine does its work, or even before, it can combine with those contaminants, depending on the level of contaminants, and it creates combined chlorine, or what we know as chloramines. And those are in basically three different types, monochloramine, dichloramine, or trichloramine. And so Breakpoint, is traditionally, and taught in CPO, is a method where you increase the free available chlorine level to a point where you accomplish what's known as a breakpoint, or a breaking apart, or basically an eradication of those combined chlorines, and you oxidize them off. And the primary one, I guess the basic one we always hear about, is ammonia or chlorine combined to ammonia. So the breakpoint is the point at which you're going to oxidize all the ammonia out as nitrogen gas, and then the chlorine becomes oxidized down to a chloride.
So maybe to kind of focus this down, shocking is a very general term. It can
absolutely
can mean whatever it means to you. I think about how most residential pools are treated. All the chlorine for the week is poured in one dose.
That's
and
true.
A lot the guys who trained me, and down to this day, a lot of guys don't measure. They just go up to a 10,000 gallon pool, and it needs a half a gallon this week, or it needs a gallon. Well, if you do the math, it only takes 10.7 ounces of liquid chlorine to give you 1 part per million in a residential pool. If you pour a gallon in that pool, you've shocked it. You've super chlorinated. So a lot of these pools get that every week.
Yeah, that's very true. And and if you're using a 12.5% liquid, you're actually getting 12.5 ppm in 10,000 gallons if you put a gallon in. So yeah, that's quite a bit, and that is a superchlorination. And then if somebody thinks, well, I'm going to shock the pool and I'm going to hit it with 2 gallons this week, they may have accomplished a hyperchlorination at that point. So yeah.
So then superchlorination too is kind of a non-specific amount of chlorine. Breakpoint chlorination, it comes out of CPO training, and it is a calculated formula that tells you, based on the amount of total chlorine in the pool, or combined chlorine in the pool, you dose this amount of chlorine to deal with it. And that's one of the things I think. There's some myths out there that CPO is only for commercial pools. CPO is only if you're doing residential pools, you don't need it. What I believe strongly is that everybody should start with this as their basic training, because it teaches you not to fly by the seat of your pants, not to add a chlorine based on, well, that seems about right.
No. Absolutely. And I think the most probably vital thing for a residential tech from CPO that they're going to get, which is another thing I had no concept of when I was doing residential pools, but just basically learning that chemical dosing method,
right.
To make sure, so if I got a million gallon pool, and how much, and I'm reading something that says add 10 ounces per 10,000 gallons, how do I figure that out? And I think that's one of the very beneficial things of CPO, is it teaches you the math and the dosing and so forth.
And the very first equation they teach you is how to measure the gallonage in your pool. How do you properly manage a pool and dose the chemicals if you don't know the size of the pool? How many gallons are you treating?
Yes, absolutely.
So without getting into the math, let's just say that it's out there, and that breakpoint chlorination is designed to get the chloramines out of the pool and free up your available chlorine to build a residual and work to protect the bathers.
Yes.
But there's different types of chloramines. The basic, early on in the process, the monochloramines, they're fairly harmful, even have a little bit of residual sanitizing capability, although they're very slow to act. But the longer they last in the water and the more they react with things, they degenerate into a lot more serious uh, health issue causing chemicals. Trihalomethanes. We've talked to Chip Blatchley on the podcast, talking about cyanogen chloride, nitrogen trichloride. When you get these types of things in the pool, there's cases on the CDC website where it sent people to the hospital in an indoor pool inhaling these things. So how effective is breakpoint chlorination at treating the really bad chloramines?
Hey, well, you know, the thing is, you got to look at the history of Breakpoint, and some people, and even I myself, I didn't know that where Breakpoint came from. Was it the pool industry? Where was it? Well, no, it wasn't the pool industry. So, I mean, Breakpoint goes back to the 1920s when they were treating drinking water with chlorine, and basically the actual Breakpoint method that was determined that they came up with was for the purpose of removing ammonia from drinking water, or in some cases wastewater as well. So basically what they were trying to do was just to remove the one thing, ammonia. And a lot of times in the case of drinking water, the ammonia was added initially because they were trying to deal with odors or other things like that, or, for various reasons, or even trying to stabilize chlorine. Because as you pointed out, you do create a stable form of chlorine when you combine ammonia with chlorine and you create a pure monochloramine. That is a disinfectant, and that's actually still practiced in drinking water today. And even you might hear the term chlorination. That's purposely done because it is a more stable, slower reacting, longer lasting disinfectant. So they can pump these monochloramines into the pipes, and the drinking water stays disinfectant until it goes through all the pipes and all the system and into your house and out your faucet. So that's kind of theoretical drinking water treatment. So Breakpoint was where they were, if they were having problems with too much ammonia, trying to balance the chlorine residuals and so forth, that was developed from that standpoint. Now, it's interesting to note, again, we were talking about just chlorine combining with ammonia, and that's where Breakpoint was originated. And basically, initially, and this is actually if you look in White's handbook on chlorination, he talks a lot about this and the development of Breakpoint for drinking water. The initial beginning of Breakpoint was a 3-to-2 ratio. So basically 3 moles chlorine, 2 moles ammonia, if you want to look at it that way. And you could get removal of ammonia from the water. They also found, and this is early on, but they found that once you kind of hit that threshold of 5-to-1, so 5-to-1 ratio, you could begin to develop dichloramines and even trichloramines from that standpoint. This process went on. It's extremely complicated, and if you read White's handbook, definitely if you can't sleep at night, you could read the whole chapter on Breakpoint, and by the time you're done, you'd be knocked out. But it got to a point where they found that at a certain pH, and the pH was generally between 6 to 8, they came up with this determination of about from 7.6 to just about 10 as a molar ratio. And that began to become the practice. But again, keep in mind, all they were trying to do was remove chemical ammonia from the water. So you bring up a good point, and the very good point that you bring up, and you'll find this in White's handbook, you'll find this in CPO manual, you'll find this in any technical manual, organic chloramines. And organic chloramines are basically anything from organic nitrogen that's in there. And I can tell you, and I always, when I teach basic water chemistry class, one of the first statements I make, and Dave, maybe you've heard me say this, I say our pools that we use and the pools that you service would be nearly perfect, except for one thing. And the one thing is people get in them and people use
right,
them.
Exactly. Yeah.
And what people bring is perspiration, they bring amino acids, creatine, proteins, cosmetics, all these organic, urea is the big one. It's in your perspiration, it's in your pee, and we all know people pee in a pool. I just saw a survey. And fecal matter as well, 1/10 of a gram of fecal matter on a showered body. So, just you imagine 50 kids jumping in the pool and then do your math on that. So all these things, really, Breakpoint was not designed or created to deal with those. And we all know also superchlorination, any kind of shocking, really is not real effective against organic bound chloramines from that standpoint.
So, and that kind of brings up another thing that I thought about as I was going through the CPO training. We're really limited in terms of our ability to test the water. We don't, when we test for combined chlorine, it's not telling us, are these monochloramines or is it cyanogen chloride? It all shows up the same. It's just a darkening of color. And so I talked to Blatchley again about this, and he's like, well, you'd need scientific grade instruments to measure, laboratory grade instruments. And we're not going to do that. So
no, and those instruments are out there, but they're expensive, and they're difficult to use, and you have to be a scientist a lot of times to kind of figure out that you're doing the method right and so forth. So as I said, I teach CPO. I've taught CPO for a long time, and this question always came up during the break part. Well, how do I tell the difference? And I had kind of this. I think, I don't know if it was too smart or not smart. It was just kind of an archaic method. I said, well, hey, you do your DPD test, you test for your combines, you superchlorinate, you let your chlorine come back down or you neutralize it or whatever. Then you do a test again. If you still have chloramines, they're probably organic, and at that point, if you do still have a good level of chloramines showing up in your test, then I would suggest you probably want to dilute some water out.
Yeah, that's about the only way that you can do it is if you've got the really bad stuff. We're kind of limited even in terms of equipment we could add to the pool. Blatchley was talking about a way of aerating the water and getting them out that way, but then you've got to keep those fumes away from people.
Yes.
And it's just it's not something you can just go down to your local SCP and pick up something and add it to the pool to get rid of those.
Yeah, and I'm just going to say, like I said, when I started out, I was a lot in the residential, but then I went to commercial, and a big part of my job when I was with C-Clear in the later years was doing commercial technical work and commercial sales. So I dealt with a lot of commercial pools, went to a lot of commercial pools. I was in a lot of facilities. And I can tell you, for the most part, just about any indoor facility that I walked into, there was that, prevalent, overwhelming chlorine odor that was there. And it just seemed to be a normal in indoor pools. But as time went on and as systems started to change, and as these secondary disinfectant systems began to kind of become more prevalent, I started to notice, and particularly in newer pools. And I can give you one example. I live in a small little town, Snohomish, Washington, and we had an old indoor pool, where the chloramines were so bad that what happened was they had steel girders that held up the building. Well, the steel girders had dissolved because the chloramine in the air there was terrible. I can tell you, I tried taking my kids there a couple of times when they were little, and I walked in the door and we turned around and walked back out because it was awful. You couldn't even see, it was so bad. So they condemned that building. The good news from that was we got a brand new aquatic facility out of that deal. And this brand new aquatic facility, the main competitive pool was saltwater generated. They also had UV, and it just had a state-of-the-art system. And I remember getting called out on that pool to help out the operator. And that was one of the first facilities that I ever walked into where I didn't smell chlorine.
Right.
And this is, I'll say this now and maybe we'll say it later, but I'm a firm believer in what you're doing too, Dave, with what you do with ozone, is any proactive oxidation. If we have proactive oxidation, and that even goes to if somebody doesn't have ozone, doesn't have UV or all that, but if they are really, really diligent at proactive, even superchlorination, you can reduce that organic load to where you don't have those contaminants, and you don't end up forming those trihalomethanes, that off gas, and create all that irritant. So I think there's a lot of advancement on the commercial end that's going to help. And certainly the other one is air handling as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Get that bad air out.
Yeah.
And I agree with you. I really like the idea of chlorine as not necessarily a standalone sanitizer. I do know that ozone works extremely well. Both chlorine and ozone are slow to react with the ammonia-based contaminants that cause chloramines, but together the chlorine breaks these things down into things that the ozone is able to oxidize right away. So if you have a properly sized ozone system, you don't get them. The best way to not have the really bad chloramines in your pool is not to let chloramines get started, not to give them a foothold.
Yes, absolutely agreed. I mean, if you're, and this is another thing I think, and I think if we go back in pool history and so forth, our pools, the pools we have today, and of course now we're kind of in this pandemic thing and there's closures and all that, and I'm talking commercially again here. But until that, let's just say pre-pandemic days or whatever, it's my firm belief that our commercial pools were absolutely overloaded. And these pools were not designed for the bather load and the length of hours that a lot of these facilities began to incorporate. I think, when I was a kid, maybe, and I went to a commercial pool or an indoor pool, it was, the pool was open from, 10 to 6 or something, and that's the way it was in our days. And so I think that from a chemical standpoint, from a filtration and a turnover rate and a recovery standpoint, that water was a lot better because it just had the time to sort of recover. But then we kind of got into this new world of, where you've got swim teams, you've got the seniors, you've got the aerobics program, and you've got aquatic facilities that have to make money and they have to make revenue. So they're bringing in as many people as they can. They're staying open as long as they can. And those systems just aren't designed to handle the length of hours and so forth, and not have enough recovery time and allow the chemical to do its work. So I think that was a big part of the problem, and is a big part of the problem.
Well, I think it's a problem too in the light commercial world: hotels, motels,
Yes.
HOAs, apartment complexes. The systems are very poorly designed and very poorly regulated. There's
Agreed.
no chlorine. There's no proper chlorine dosing system on these pools. No. A lot of them are still even managed by hand.
Yeah.
With high, as high of cyanuric acid levels as the health department will allow. And we had one of the kind of running gags on our podcast early on was we'd ask people in the industry, would you get into a hotel pool at the end of the day after a long day on the trade show floor? What we have is an industry full of people that won't use our own product.
Oh yeah, no, and I, as a guy who traveled tons up until the pandemic, and spent a lot of time in hotels, There's always that familiar, you open the door and there's the chlorine smell in the lobby, coming from the pool. If there's an indoor pool, and I can tell you, I can't tell you the number of places I've gone to and I've walked in and, you can look over and you're checking in and you can look over and there's the pool. You can see the pool. It's an indoor pool in an enclosure and you can see it. And I've seen pools that look like a vat of milk. This is no joke, a vat of milk. And I've looked over and thought, oh my God, that pool's closed or whatever. And then as I'm looking, I see little heads popping up out of the water, and the pool's open. But I think the one point I want to bring out is that you're right, Dave. You're right about the different species of chlorine and chloramines that are in the water that Breakpoint is just not designed to handle. And you have to use other systems. And I'm a firm believer in layers of protection. I think chlorine is one of the probably vital layers that's needed. And probably the main reason I say that is from the standpoint of chlorine's ability to oxidize and chlorine's ability to keep a residual. I think those are two important factors from chlorine. However, chlorine, I teach this in chemistry too. And when I talk about proactive oxidation and those kinds of things, why do we use chlorine in a pool? And I ask this question when I teach basic water chemistry. I say, why are you putting chlorine in your pools when you go service your pools? What are you doing that for? This is just something you do, or what? And I get the answer, well, we're trying to kill bacteria. Somebody, will raise their hand and finally say that. And I say, yes, that's the point. The primary reason we're servicing that pool and putting a sanitizer in there is because we don't want the people who use the pool to get sick.
Right.
Because if they get sick and they die, then you don't have customers. And then you're out of business, right? So, or they're just not going to use you anymore. So that is the primary reason for a chlorine sanitizer. However, if that chlorine sanitizer is getting tied up, oxidizing all these organic contaminants and so forth that are in the water, it's not doing its job and you're wasting money. So we have to develop levels and systems where we proactively oxidize and we deal with those contaminants, and that's ozone or UV, regular shocking, however that's done, and then you add your your sanitizer and you're dealing with bacteria and so forth. So there has to be layers and there has to be a system.
That brings up another limitation of our testing capabilities that we have. When you roll up on a pool, like you said, say you're servicing that milky pool that everybody's jumping in, a pool that reaches that state not only has no chlorine in it, but it hasn't had for quite some time.
Yes. Yeah.
We don't have any way of testing what that oxidative load is that we have to get rid of before we can start to rebuild a chlorine residual. So it's just kind of guesswork and seat of the pants when we roll up on a cloudy pool. What do we do?
Well, and I'm going to tell you my number one answer in a pool like that, which I told someone at a hotel where the one I was telling you about, I witnessed it. And I informed the guy that I was a CPO operator and I couldn't in good conscience check in and not say something about that pool. My primary advice on a pool like that is, if you can, drain it. Just drain it, because water is cheaper than chemicals. And when you're at that standpoint, and again, like you said, Dave, you got to do some figuring. You don't know how much is it going to take. So that would be my number one. If that's an impossibility or whatever, and I would say, even if you can drain half of it, if you can drain a quarter of it and dilute it out, dilution goes a long ways in that case. Then I would say, but if you couldn't drain any, or that was a problem, then that's where I'm going to say hyperchlorination. Hit it with 40 ppm, and
close the pool, for crying out loud.
Oh, close the pool, absolutely. Well, I mean, if you're hyperchlorinating, the pool must be closed. So. I mean, unless you want to, bleach somebody completely out. So that's where I would start there. And I mean, again, it's the pool business and pool chemistry it's like alchemy. It basically is. There's a lot, and I find this and I worked very closely with very intelligent PhD microbiologists, scientists, all sorts of people. And I can tell you, and everybody's, right now you hear science, science, science. It's kind of, to defend anything and everything. Well, science is, it's theoretical. It's very theoretical and experimental. And there's a lot we don't understand. And we're talking about a subject right now, Breakpoint, that is still not completely understood.
Right.
You can read White's manual. You can talk to Blatchley. They're still doing the research because we don't understand this. We don't have it down, and we don't know all the reactions. And it's that way with anything. The complete reactions are still never completely understood, and that's why we have science, and that's why we research, and that's why we keep going.
Right.
There's another really important thing that I think comes out of CPO training. It trains you to think about is that a swimming pool is an open environment.
Yes.
People get in it, animals get in it, stuff blows in it, things drop out of the sky, pollution, smog. I mean, it's just every pool is a little bit different. To me, there's a huge difference between science as it's performed in a laboratory and science in the real world, which is what basically all of us as pool technicians are really we're practicing science.
Yes, absolutely, whether we know it or not.
And it all comes down to really the quality of our pool care, the science behind how we treat a pool comes down to our data collection.
Yes.
And it comes down to that doing the math that we talked about earlier, knowing the gallonage in our pools, measuring our water quality thoroughly, keeping track of how we're dosing things. That's really the only way that we know when we start to have water problems. We can look back over our records and go, whoa, here's a blip here. And we can start to take a scientific approach to the way we manage our pools. But until we do that, if we're just flying by the seat of our pants, we're guessing. We really have nothing to go on.
No, that's a huge point, Dave, and the biggest part of that is the data. It is the data, and as I said, I've spent a lot of time around science. I've spent a lot of time in labs, and particularly one place I worked with, that's the one thing I'll tell you about anybody who's a chemist, a scientist, a microbiologist that's working in a lab, is those guys keep data. I mean, they write everything down, they keep track of everything, and they evaluate that data and they compare that data. And that's how you come up with good science. You have to have the data, you have to have good data, you have to understand what you're doing. You have to look at it, review it, compare it, and see where the differences are, where the incongruities are, and make changes based on intelligent data. And you're right, that's what a pool tech needs to do. And so I would say for anybody who's not keeping track of or keeping records, and we talk about this in CPO, right? It gets into negligence and going into a court of law or whatever, is that you must have good records for what you're doing.
If you make somebody sick, or if not necessarily you made them sick, but if they get sick in your pool and they decide it's your fault, that they're going to blame your water chemistry, or if their plasters failing and they want to blame your water chemistry, if you don't have the records and the data, you've got no way to defend yourself. It's automatically going to get dumped on your shoulders.
Yes, absolutely true. And the other point that I'll bring up here, since as we pointed out earlier, with the advent of social media and the internet and Instagram and all this and all the so-called knowledge that is out there and education that is out there, there is a lot of incorrect education out there. Yeah. And the one thing I came across, even when trade shows were still meeting, and I'd be teaching a basic water chemistry class. And so I'm teaching my basic water chemistry class, and I'm teaching everything in there according to standards. When I'm talking water balance, whatever I'm talking, and I'm saying, here's the standards. Okay. And then I'll get somebody to raise my hand and say, I was just in another class and they told me I could keep my pH at 8 because of da 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 da. And I'm like, okay, that's fine. You want to do that because it works, or they gave you some other system or told you, that they were gurus about this or that. But let me just say one thing. If you have something happen at one of your pools where a client gets sick, a kid gets pink eye, whatever, and you get sued and taken into court, and you maybe kept data and you're showing, hey, I kept my pH at 8 because so-and-so at the, trade show told me it's a whole new, winky dinky method. And then they're going to say, well, here's the standards.
Yeah.
Here's the PHTA standards. A lawyer is going to get the standards and they're going to say, these are the standards and you weren't in the standards.
Right.
This is important.
Yes.
There's a reason for these things. And you may agree or disagree, but again, from a legal standpoint, you've got to be working within the standards.
100% agree.
Yeah.
Yep.
So Terry, the other thing I was going to ask you about is, in terms of the formation of chloramines, it seems to me like one of the, and this is a discussion we had with Chip Blatchley as well, that when you have a constant cycle of a pool running out of chlorine, building an oxidative load, shocking it back to health, and then trying to rebuild a residual, repeatedly going through a cycle like that, that in itself is a recipe for creating chloramines.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And there's a ton of scenarios it just involved in that. And again, as I pointed out, and I'm sure, Chip would agree with that. And if you read some of, Chip's, research and articles, he talks a lot about the varying and different types of chlorine species that are in there that we still don't even understand.
Yeah.
Bather load plays a huge part in this. Air handling plays a huge part in this. The source water plays a huge part in this.
Yep.
I had a situation, I dealt with a YMCA, a brand new YMCA that was built, and the air handling system had problems from the get-go. They actually needed to have evacuators put in. There's a whole thing in the design that was just completely off, where they were even having the bad air was kind of being drawn into one corner of the building. And then listen to this. So you had the sort of the chloramine gas or the chloramine air being drawn into one corner of the building. And in the corner of that building, they had their hot tub.
Oh.
Right in front of the vent. So you had all this evaporation and hot, moist air from the hot tub in front of the vent, and this air was passing through that, and their vents were corroding. But the other thing we found out, the guy couldn't figure out, is he was trying to dilute out the water, but then he'd still have combined chlorine. Well, come to find out that his source water was chlorinated. So that was a whole nother thing. So, and again, this will lead into that cycle if you don't understand that.
Right.
So I did an in-depth review with this guy, and air handling had to be changed. They needed to add evacuators. When he topped off or diluted, I actually suggested that he add a little bit of a superchlorination of liquid to deal with the chlorination that was coming in, because those are just monochloramines. And if you hit them at the right time, monochloramines are going to quickly convert to dichloramine, and that dichloramine should gas out if you're doing it properly. So, but you are right. I mean, right now there are so many different scenarios, and just bather load again alone is enough. And what's going on, and what's on bodies, and what's coming out of people. I think somebody did a study on pharmaceuticals and things like that are in our systems that are coming out. But they did some research on kind of the top items. You know what one of the number one contaminants from a person was that they found out was caffeine.
Really?
Caffeine, yeah. And then now this will blow your mind.
So that's just oozing out of your pores and into the water?
Well, obviously, if you're urinating and you just had a Starbucks prior, that's going to be it. But another thing, one other thing that I thought was amazingly interesting, and I guess maybe because it was summertime or whatever, I think the number 2 or number 3 item that was coming from bathers was DEET, mosquito repellent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and we're living in this world today where we have so many products and so many different chemicals and things that we didn't have 20 years ago that are being used and that are in the atmosphere and that are in the water.
Yeah.
And it all plays a part.
There's a study in Canada that happened recently where they used aspartame, artificial sweetener,
Yes,
to measure how much urine was in a pool, because they figure that's the only sources of that getting into a pool is if somebody were to urinate it out.
well, they've also done studies where people have ingested the pool water, and then when they urinate, there's cyanuric acid coming from the urine as well. So I don't know if that's a good way. I don't know if that's a good CYA test for levels, but that's been done. So
CYA is an entirely another rabbit hole that we could climb down, and we probably don't have time for it today. But what I wanted to do, and kind of in closing, is it seems to me like the best way to deal with chloramines is to do everything within our power to prevent them from forming in the first place.
Yes, I agree. Absolutely agree. So from my standpoint, non-device or whatever, I'm going to say, any proactive oxidation or just regular oxidation would help. Look, I go way back to that pool I told you about, the first pool in my little town that ended up dissolving because they had such a chloramine problem.
Yes.
I went to the operator of that pool before they condemned the pool, and I basically told them the pool was going to get condemned if they went too much longer this way. And he asked me for a suggestion, and one of the suggestions I said was, because he said they were using non-chlorine shock, but they were only using half the amount because of a budget. And I told him, I said, look, here's how you have to dose. Here's the gallonage of your pool. So try it. And he actually began doing proactive oxidation just with non-chlorine shock and using the correct amount. And he called me on the phone to say, I've noticed such a difference. The air is cleaner, everything's better. So thanks for that advice. So just doing things properly and being proactive at doing some oxidation, that's number one. But then let's go on to, I'm a big proponent of devices, anything like ozone and UV are the two. And both of those certainly have their, their valor in, dealing with organic materials and knocking those down so you don't have the buildup to deal with. And again, the main purpose of putting your chlorine in is you want to kill bacteria and protect your swimmers. So anything you can do proactively, to deal with the organic waste and even the ammonia waste coming from perspiration and so forth is a huge plus. So whatever that is,
What I also think, and one thing I'm a big proponent of, is using chlorine properly, which means dosing it properly.
Correct.
There are so many systems out there that are ORP pH controllers that are only slightly more than the cost of a salt system, but you're dosing the right amount of chlorine at the right time, and you avoid these wild swings in chlorine residual. That in itself, it seems to me, if you kept the right amount of chlorine in a pool at all times, regardless of bather load, that would in itself reduce chloramines.
No, that absolutely true. I absolutely agree with that. And again, it comes down to knowing the pool, knowing the behavior and the habits and things that are going on in the pool, and having your chlorine adjusted for what's going to be going on in the pool. Obviously, Dave, I mean, if somebody's going to have a swim party, if you don't deal with that, or you come back the next week, you've got problems. You need to adjust for the behavior of the particular pool and what's going to be going on in there. And you need to adjust your chlorine. And that's why, again, I'm a proponent of, just do some regular proactive oxidation, you know?
Yeah.
So another dosing system that's considerably more low tech, but you have a product known as the liquidator
That's right.
that will dose chlorine gradually throughout the week. And I'm actually really anxious to try one of these out on a really simple pool, but as opposed to trying to pour all of your chlorine into the pool directly once a week, pour it into something that's going to dose it gradually and release it gradually so that you, again, avoid those wild swings.
Yeah, no, and thanks for bringing that up. And that's definitely the beauty. And obviously there's different various ways to feed liquid. You could use a Rollichem unit, something like that, or a peristaltic pump, I guess. But HASA has the liquidator, and the kind of the cool thing about the liquidator, and we have a new version actually coming out this year, is that it relies strictly on hydraulics. It's pretty simple. There's no additional electricity or anything required. It's kind of a in and out system. And the cool thing about it too is it kind of perfectly mixes the pool water with the chlorine that's in the unit, and then disperses that. As I said, you can adjust it. You can actually do a superchlorinate with it if you wanted to, if you opened it, full up and let it go for a while, and then you just, ratchet it back down. But it's a cool, simple little unit where, you can get that daily delivery, and you don't have to kind of do the once a week bomb, or you don't have to kind of say, hey, I'm going to leave this half a gallon with, Mrs. Smith or Mr. Smith and hope that they put it in the middle of the week, and they usually don't. So
right.
They never do.
Yeah. But no, thanks for bringing that up. Great system. And I'm just kind of as an aside, I'm going to say with what's going on with the tablet situation right now, the liquidators are in high demand. So
I'm sure.
Now, and the other thing too, the way I understand it, the liquidator also separates out the impurities, the contaminants, the salts.
Yeah, and that's a proprietary technology that we have too. That the use of the sodium hypochlorite in the liquidator, it actually does have a softening effect of the water, and it does separate out some of the calcium salts, and they will accumulate in the bottom of this, the tank that you have, and then probably once a year, maybe a couple times a year, you clean those out. They're inert. You can put them in a bag or whatever, or you can put them in your garden for that standpoint. But that's a really cool thing about the unit too, is that it will reduce, and it'll actually reduce the need for acid as a standpoint from that as well.
I'll link to it too, because I think there's a video out there, Terry. Aren't you talking about the liquidator?
The liquidator. There's kind of some archaic videos on that.
They're archaic videos. Okay.
Yeah, but that's fine. And they certainly, probably hasa.com is probably the best place to kind of go and get info on that. So.
Gotcha. Yeah. We're also going to provide a link to the Aqua article that Terry was talking about, the superchlorination article. That is actually in the description of this video if you're watching it on YouTube. So feel free to click on that if you'd like to read more from that article that Terry did in Aqua. And aren't you a contributing editor or author?
Yes, I am.
Okay, I thought so. Yeah.
I think I've been writing so much and for so many years that they just decided to.
They're like, just put him in there.
Contributing editor. Yeah.
So in closing, did you have something else, Dave? Because I wanted to close up with the bleach thing.
No, that's fine.
Okay.
Thank you, Terry. We really appreciate your time here, and you've given us a lot of really good information to think about.
As always.
Appreciate it. Yeah, thanks, Dave.
Yeah. Hopefully, moving forward, we can start treating our pools a little better.
Yes.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Well, that's the plan. It's good to have information like this being put out there. So really appreciate you guys. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks.
In closing, I want to talk about bleach just for a second, because Terry mentioned this to me, gosh, probably a year ago at the beginning of the pandemic. Terry, you and I had a side conversation about bleach, and Terry mentioned to me that in regards to colds or any kind of bacteria, colds, flu, any of that type of stuff, his family has had a bleach solution in their kitchen for years. What'd you say, 20 years or something?
Yep.
You have a diluted bleach solution in your kitchen. So every day you spray down the kitchen after you clean and or cook and do the dishes and all that. You spray everything down. I don't know if you do doorknobs and things like that too.
Yeah, everything.
You said you
refrigerator
thought it contributed.
handles.
Oh, refrigerator handles.
Yeah.
And you said you really thought that contributed to the family being less sick throughout the years, like
Absolutely.
less colds, less flu, things like that. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, no, I can tell you that, and both my kids are adults now, but through all their childhood and so forth, where even we would even hear of, the classroom, you know how it is when a classroom, somebody gets the stomach flu, and every kid has a stomach flu, and
Right.
we'd hear of friends having the stomach flu, and really our kids rarely got any kind of stomach ailments, stomach flus, a lot of things, rarely sick. And I'm going to say it's a big part of that because I was at a presentation and I listened to Charles Gerba, who's a microbiologist from Arizona State University. And he made the comment that, your kitchen is dirtier than your bathroom. Actually, your kitchen sink has more bacteria and germs than your toilet bowl. Right. Because of all the food prep and everything else that goes on in there. And he said that a simple spray down of, you take a quart spray bottle and, you can basically just put, maybe half a teaspoon, drops of chlorine in there. It doesn't take much. And when you do your cleanup and you're finished doing your dishes or whatever, spray your knobs down, your counters, your sink, your sink handles and so forth. Just wipe them down. And he said, you're killing a lot of that, and you're disinfecting a lot of those things that cause, those stomach issues, flus, things like that. So we've done it, we practice it, and I can tell you, we've got a fairly healthy family through 20 years. So
I just feel like with, bacteria being a big topic of discussion in many, many ways, and there's lots of differing opinions about one thing or what we should be doing and shouldn't be doing.
Yeah.
But I thought this is a way that we can all get behind, and maybe it'll help prevent the cold at your house or the flu or whatever it might be out there.
I mean, if you look on the CDC sites and you look even on World Health Organization, a lot of these health authorities and everything, and it's liquid sodium hypochlorite bleach is one of the number one things they're recommending for even, COVID prevention and so forth. And so, I not to tout articles I've written, but I wrote an article on the history of chlorine bleach and how it's been used throughout the ages to prevent virus like, cholera and typhoid and things like that. In fact, the reason chlorine is used in our drinking water is because of typhoid. There was such a huge typhoid outbreak, and then somebody came up with the idea of adding chlorine to disinfect it, and the typhoid cases went down to near zero. So good, practical, historical, product.
And maybe you'll prevent somebody in your household from getting a cold or flu. So I recommend doing that. I've been doing it ever since you told me about it.
Yeah.
Early last year. So just another tip there to help out, maybe not pool related, but still a way to, try to prevent bad, colds or things happening in your household from spreading. So it was a good idea.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you so much, Terry, for coming on.
Thanks, Terry.
Yeah, you bet. Thank you, guys.
Yes, always a pleasure having you.
Yeah, thank you.
A new voice in the industry, a resource for all, education for you. This is Pool Pro Podcast. Build relationships and share important news as we get ready for our next backyard adventure. Pool Pro Podcast. Backyard adventures are better together. Please take a moment to share, like, and review our content with all of those that would be interested.